we can see those geysers from bursting mortar shells and artillery shells being tossed up in the air. The land just beyond the water seems to be aflame. You can doubtlessly hear this gunfire going on all around us.
Starting from February 19 until March 26, 1945, this is what the soldiers fighting in the Battle of Iwo Jima, arguably the bloodiest battle of World War II, went through every day. It was as close to hell as one could get, claiming the lives of around 7,000 US Marines and 22,000 Japanese soldiers, wounding about 20,000 others. The American military needed medical personnel on the battlefield to nurse those who were wounded and take care of their casualties in order to ensure victory. Thus, the first female Navy flight nurses came into play, and among that crew was the first female flight nurse to fly to an active combat zone in the Pacific. Courageous 22-year-old Ensign Jane Kendeigh.
My best friend, Jane Kendeigh Cheverton, was the first nurse on Iwo Jima, the first ever sent into a combat area.
Jane Louise Kendeigh was born to Earl Samuel Kendeigh and Olive Maretta Bates in Henrietta, Ohio on March 30, 1922. She was raised on an apple orchard farm on Gifford Road. She was a brilliant young girl and became an honor student and the valedictorian of Henrietta High School, graduating in 1940. Ever since she was little, she had wanted to become a nurse. She decided to fulfill her ambition by graduating from the St. Luke School of Nursing in Cleveland in 1943, joining the U.S. Naval Nurse Corps shortly thereafter. As an ensign, Kendeigh was first trained at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois and was then sent to the Naval Hospital at Treasure Island. She then became one of the 12 nurses who comprised the first group to volunteer and be selected for training as air evacuation flight nurses in the U.S. Navy School of Air Evacuation in Alameda, California. Ensign Kendeigh, along with her fellow classmates, was trained and prepared for crash procedures and field survival. She was also trained to treat patients at high altitudes and other difficult situations. Ultimately, her goal was to rescue wounded soldiers sent to distant lands during World War II, to save those who were to save the nation. After graduating from the school on January 22, 1945, Ensign Kendeigh was assigned to the VE-2 squadron, where she was with 11 other nurses, but would later be assigned to the VRE-1 squadron. During this time, women were just starting to gain official military positions. However, the military decided to allow flight nurses to fly into combat zones, sending Navy photographer Lieutenant Gil DeWitt to board Lieutenant Ann Purvis's plane in order to document the first Navy nurse in action. However, Lieutenant DeWitt discovered upon arrival that Lieutenant Purvis's plane had departed ahead of schedule, so he did the next best thing and boarded Jane Kendeigh's C-47 military transport aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant J. M. Burns. Upon arriving at Iwo Jima, an island that is part of the Volcano Islands archipelago, which in turn is part of far southern Japan, on March 6, 1945, the plane spent an hour and a half circling the field as an offshore bombardment was occurring.
So they were flying around this island during that period of time watching this. You know, Iwo Jima is shaped like a pork chop, and this is up in the meaty area of the pork chop, really. They're now getting into that bad terrain of northern Iwo Jima, and so it was a grueling time for them. But that began that terrible last phase of Iwo Jima that morning.
We circled and circled the small island, Lieutenant DeWitt would later recall, and watched the bursting shells beneath us like firecrackers on the 4th of July.
And Lieutenant Gil DeWitt, who happened to be on the plane with Jane, said, when we landed, we inquired about Lieutenant Purvis, where is she? And they were told that her plane had missed the island. And therefore, by happenstance, Jane became the first flight nurse to land in a active combat zone, and DeWitt happened to be with her, and he was right in position to take this photograph.
She became known as the most whistled-at nurse in the Pacific when a photo of her nursing the wounded soldiers made the front page of newspapers across the nation. However, instead of celebrating her accomplishment and straying from her mission, Ensign Kendeigh immediately got to work. The hospital already had many wounded soldiers in critical condition waiting to be evacuated. As a commissioned officer, a flight nurse's job was critical, as evacuation flights did not include doctors. Her work varied from starting IVs, checking vitals, and treating wounds to applying medical oxygen and raising the spirits of wounded soldiers. Barbara Miller Finch, a war correspondent who once traveled with Jane Kendeigh on the same plane, recalled, she would acquaint herself with the needs of each case, making a mental chart of the condition of each of the 20 wounded men. In one particular instance, young Marine Sergeant William J. Wyckoff was lying on a stretcher in the hospital, dazed and in horrible shape. While he was lying on the stretcher, he suddenly saw flashing lights popping in front of him. "I tried to jump off the stretcher," he said. "Then I heard this woman's voice. I was so shocked to hear a woman's voice. That woman was Ensign Kendeigh, who said, 'Don't worry, it's only Navy photographers.' He wasn't exactly sure where he was, as he said, 'I knew I was on Iwo Jima, but, she was there.' She took care of him and comforted him, trying her best to alleviate his agony." Ensign Kendeigh worked tirelessly for 15 days until all of her patients were safely transported to ambulances in Guam. She and her fellow colleagues would save nearly 2,400 soldiers and corpsmen, nursing them back to health on the battlefield, and then flying them to safety thousands of miles away. When she got on the plane back home, the pilot asked if she'd been afraid during her trip to Iwo Jima. "I don't remember being frightened while we were on the ground," she responded. "There wasn't time to think about anything except getting these wounded men on board. But now that we are safe, in the air again, I find my knees are shaking so I can hardly stand up."
Now, Jane was Navy Reserve, but I'm going to tell you, the Marines see her as their own. She's theirs in their mind. So that's really what they refer to her as the Angel of Mercy.
After her work at Iwo Jima was over, Ensign Kendeigh's next daring mission was to rescue and evacuate the soldiers in Okinawa, a small island that is part of Japan, once again creating history when she earned the additional honor of being the first nurse to land on a battlefield at Okinawa on April 7, 1945. During the beginning of her service in Okinawa, she was ordered to go on a month-long war-bound tour. She then requested to return to the combat zone, and she made a total of 6 flights to Okinawa. However, it was not for the purpose of achieving another distinction that she went there, rather to save more lives and comfort those who were fighting abroad, knowing there was a chance they might never see their loved ones again. Ensign Kendeigh also served at battlefronts in Marianas and Hawaii. She didn't stop until she completed her task, but even after she nursed the soldiers, she kept their spirits up. A press release once described her as 108 pounds of green-eyed charm and efficiency. But behind her smiling, cheerful face was pure grit and a relentless spirit. She herself once said, "You live on your nerves. It was after I got back to Guam that I got to thinking about it. Gee, I really went through that." Once her service was over, she married Navy Lieutenant Robert E. Cheverton, an air evacuation pilot. Their wedding took place on Valentine's Day, 1946, in San Marino, California. They had 3 daughters. She continued to be a nurse even after the war, but this time at a doctor's office in San Diego. During an email interaction with her youngest daughter, Debbie, I learned that after Ensign Kendeigh married, she got out of the Navy and left it behind, choosing to raise a family instead. She said, "I learned at an early age that when anyone outside or in the family asked her about Navy life, she would change the subject. I remember her telling me that being a wife and a mother were more important to her. She was the best at both. She was a beautiful lady inside and out." Ensign Kendeigh's granddaughter, Julie Wright, told me, "Even though I'm her blood, I couldn't say very much about her military life. She and my grandfather didn't talk about it when we visited."
So it was common for them to come home, and they didn't need to tell stories. Everybody had stories in their minds they thought were probably more important than their own. So Jane was like that as well. She just kept quiet. Jane needs to be known.
Although Ensign Kendeigh never shared her military experiences with her family, she would always remember those she helped, as evidenced during a reunion in San Diego on February 22, 1986, with Sergeant Bill Wyckoff, whom she helped nurse back to health on the battlefield. "I couldn't believe it was her," said Wyckoff. According to a San Diego Union Tribune article, the last time she saw him, he didn't see her, as his vision was impaired by a grenade. Kendeigh was the guest of honor during the 41st Iwo Jima reunion.
They brought Bill Wyckoff out there. Marines and a nurse from Camp Pendleton actually reenacted that scene under spotlight on the stage. And then they invited Jane to come up, and the MC asked, "Have you ever met any of your Marines?" And she's no. And they brought Bill Wyckoff out on the stage, said, "This is the Marine on the stretcher." So they were finally reunited there, and it was really quite a time.
"She hadn't changed a bit," recalled Sergeant Wyckoff, who passed away in 1998. Ensign Jane Kendeigh would live on to be known as the first flight nurse to fly an evacuation mission to an active battlefield in the Pacific, being the first to land on both Iwo Jima and Okinawa. However, she never thought of her accomplishments as much, choosing rather to focus on the task at hand, which was to save the wounded soldiers who were fighting for their country. When asked about her service as a Navy flight nurse, she said, "Our rewards are wan smiles, a slow nod of appreciation, a gesture, a word, accolades greater, more heartwarming than any medal." She truly was an angel of the airfield, as the military itself describes her. But the saga of Ensign Kendeigh remains a footnote in most records of military nursing today, and she never received any medals for her service. But that didn't change her attitude towards helping the wounded soldiers on the battlefield. Reflecting on her trip to Iwo Jima and her experience there, she remarked, "I was too busy working on the patients to be afraid." She said, "I still feel the same as when I first studied. I'm being useful and helping people. It is very rewarding to give some help and comfort to other people."
She had a brother just about the same age as these Marines. And so she said that she would hope that someone else would take care of him like she was trying to take care of these Marines.
Unfortunately, Ensign Kendeigh passed away on July 19, 1987 in San Diego, California at the age of 65. But her heroic deeds will never be forgotten. She still remains the epitome of the resilience, courage, and sacrifice of the women who served during the war. Her role was no less challenging nor frightening than millions of others, yet every bit as heroic. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz said about the battle, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue, and I cannot think of a better example than Ensign Jane Kendeigh, who was willing to risk her life that very day if it meant others would be able to see the next."